In an earlier episode, we proposed that the second star of Bethlehem, the moving star which led the Magi to the Christ child, was the planet Mars. Its movements were purposeful and were intended to direct the wise men to their desired destination. Understanding the dynamic relationship between Mars and Earth within the polar configuration can provide a more detailed and accurate explanation to the story found in the Gospel of Matthew. When the Magi visited King Herod to learn the exact location of the newly born babe, they described the star which had led them there in very specific terms. Translations of the original Greek have confounded the meaning of the text, primarily because the astronomical ephemerides of the time have been forgotten. Scholars assume the sky at the time of the Nativity is generally the same sky we see today, but that is not the case. When Jesus Christ was born, our Earth was part of a congregation of planets called the polar configuration, and the sky was dominated by the planets Mars, Venus, and Saturn. In order to interpret the original Greek text, this astronomical backdrop must serve as the context. With this in mind, another look at the literary meaning of the Greek text is in order. We are introduced to the wise men from the east in the second chapter of Matthew, when they arrive in Jerusalem and ask Herod the king for the location of the newly born King of the Jews. According to the King James Version, the wise men describe the star as his star in the east. However, this is an interpretive translation, not a literal translation. The original Greek translated in the east is Anatole. It literally means a rising of a celestial body, such as the sun or stars. Anatole is derived from the Greek root anatello, which means a rising of light. Many versions of the New Testament, including the King James Version, translate the Greek Anatole as in the east. They do so on the presumption that it is in the east where the sun rises and the brightening of the morning sky originates. In other words, it is an interpretation based upon an assumption. A literal translation without prior assumptions would simply be, "We have seen his star rise." There are several modern translations that take a more literal approach. Armed with the knowledge that the star of the Magi was the morning star, the planet Mars, we can make more sense of the Greek. What the Magi saw and described to Herod was the planet Mars rising to heaven along the axis mundi. A translation based upon this context might be the following. Following their audience with Herod, the Magi went their way to Bethlehem to seek out the child. The morning star and its column led the way to the house where the Holy Family was living. When it reached the point where the column hovered directly over the house, it stopped. As in the earlier verse, Anatole should be translated as rising and not in the east. The leading of the Magi to the Christ child was an almost exact duplicate of the Exodus. In both cases, the planet Mars and its pillar led the way and then stopped at a specific and predetermined location. Certainly, the pillar is left unmentioned in Matthew's account, but the passage is incomprehensible without it. The Greek verb translated as stood, estathe, means to make to stand or to stand. It is most often used to describe a person in the standing position. The verb can also be used metaphorically, meaning to endure, continue, or persist. But Matthew is explaining a physical phenomenon which requires a literal translation. Traditional scholars struggle to account for the behavior of the star. The current arrangement of the solar system and its planets does not allow for any reasonable explanation. Within the framework of the polar configuration, the explanation is straightforward. The pillar moved in relation to the Earth as it did during the Exodus and then stopped. The end point of the pillar terminated directly over the house where the Holy Family lived, just as it did over the tent of the testimony. Matthew uses the word epano to describe the position of the star in relation to the location of the child. Epano can be translated as over, as the King James Version does, but it can also be translated as on the top of. This suggests that the home and the pillar may have been physically connected, or at least appeared to be. We must also remember that the star of the Magi was both a planet and an angel. It was not simply a star standing above or on top of the home. It was an angel standing upon the earth. This is a planetary archetype repeated often in John's Apocalypse and elsewhere. The archetype includes the planet Venus as the head, the crescent as the wings, and the axis mundi, the pillar or mountain, as the torso and legs. It is the pillar that allows the angel to stand. The appearance of the new star, the stellar explosion or supernova, and the rising of the planet Mars were coordinated events. The new star announced the birth of the Savior to the entire world, and the rising and then subsequent movement of the pillar provided the precise location of the child to the Magi and the shepherds. The heavenly host, the planets of the polar configuration, sang for joy at the event for all the world to hear.